sometimes on this channel, because it's not a, I was gonna say show. It's not a show. It's a channel. There are very basic concepts that I choose to explain, where you might assume like that it's basic knowledge. There's a reason for that, and it's because the internet is universal and it is international, and there are a lot of things that are commonly understood where I live that are not necessarily commonly understood everywhere in the world. And furthermore, it's not just about what I know and what others might not know. There's a second step to it, which is what I know others don't know, and what I don't know others don't know. There are things that I take for granted that are completely foreign to people in other countries. I know for a fact there are people watching from America, Britain, different places in Europe. There is like an international audience to Gold. And to, every YouTube channel has like an international audience. Even like channels that are kind of specialized towards a specific like country will have viewership in other places. Like that just happens. Like the internet is kind of too ubiquitous for it to not happen. And one of the things like for an example of this like phenomenon, in Britain, what I would call a biscuit is what an American would probably most likely call a cookie, right? A cookie in Britain has a very specific meaning, and the very specific meaning is kind of if you picture like a chocolate chip, it's round, like, okay, you don't need those qualities to be a cookie, but there's a difference between a biscuit and a cookie that is like, and cookies are biscuits, but biscuits are not necessarily cookies, right? That's like the British understanding. In America, they would call everything I call a biscuit, they would call a cookie. Basically everything. They would call shortbread a cookie, right? Like that's just a thing. And this isn't even true of all of the United States. This is probably also a regional thing, but as far as I understand, like having talked to Americans, it's a pretty widespread understanding of the word cookie. And they call biscuits like the word they use biscuits for something completely different that is neither a biscuit nor a cookie, right? And basically what I'm saying by this is I cannot assume the knowledge that other people have of the things I take for granted, but furthermore, I cannot, like, I have to be careful because if I assume that people know what I'm talking about, but it happens to be one of those things that I've yet to encounter that is secretly different from the way that I would say it, then people don't know what I'm talking about, and the content then becomes inaccessible. And I want people to know what I'm talking about. It comes from a desire to not be misunderstood, but it also comes from a desire for people to understand and enjoy my content equally, despite, okay, necessarily they might be in a position where they can't necessarily relate to it. And one of those reasons might be because of the language barrier. And like, okay, language barrier is a strong word. There's a communication barrier sometimes when talking with people from the United States, people who speak the American English, because like fundamentally it's the same language, and I can talk to people in America and we can understand each other. It's not a foreign language, but there are some really specific areas where it's not the same. And those really specific areas can cause a lot of confusion if you're not familiar with them and you don't understand like the differences between American and British English. And the funny thing about that to me is it's very frequently British people are very, very familiar with the differences between American and British English, and there's two reasons for it. It's twofold. First of all, way more Americans than British people, like just a colossal difference. It's probably like, if I had to guess, there's like 10 times more or something. No, that can't be right. 5 times. We'll say there's like 5 or 6 times more. It's a huge difference. There's 350 million roughly Americans, right? There's like 60 million Brits. That sounds about right to me. So we'll say 5x. Okay, that's a big difference. In my mind, that's like, you know, it does make a big difference. And then we take a look at, like, for me, it feels like we're so uniquely familiar with the differences because we watch American television. Americans don't watch British television as much. I've noticed, though, that apparently Doctor Who is picking up viewers in the US, which I think is really cool, because Doctor Who is a fantastic show, and it's one of the great British pieces of art. But yeah, no, it's interesting that, like, it's oftentimes the Brits are more familiar with those differences than your average American. All of this to say, diluting juice. People have all sorts of names for diluting juice. I call it diluting juice, and it's juice. It's strong. You put water in, and it becomes less strong. That's what diluting juice is. It's a very simple concept, but if I just say diluting juice, I don't think everyone gets it. I don't think everyone knows what I'm talking about, because some people call it squash. Some people call it squash. Some people call it cordial. I don't know what that is. Unable to access ninjakiwi.com. What? Well, I don't care. I don't want to anyway. But I don't know why that happened. If I don't explain what I'm talking about, there will be people who are familiar with diluting juice that don't know what I'm talking about when I say diluting juice, right? And I had an experience today that was quite off-putting. I drank some diluting juice. I was like, okay, we're done with this. Like, the juice, it's over. The juice is over. But I refilled the glass with water, and the water had this kind of bad taste to it because there was still a little bit of juice left. It was just super diluted at this point. So it was like water with a hint of something else, which was really, really not pleasant. And I thought it was interesting because when I came to thinking about this experience, and I was like, you know, this is something that I think is first of all, it's relatable. Second of all, it's unpleasant and kind of noteworthy in a way. I thought, like, if I just mentioned the juice on its own by the name that I call it, then the story becomes less accessible. But for the people who also call it diluting juice, or at least familiar with the term diluting juice, then it seems kind of out of place for me to explain what it is, because everyone should know it, right? So then I'm like, okay, I've got to explain why I'm explaining it, and it becomes this whole thing. And you know, it's interesting because I saw a very similar thought on Twitter recently. I saw a thread where someone was saying, what do you call this? And it was an image of someone drinking water without putting their lips to the bottles. The way I would refer to that is skying. You're skying the drink. But there were all sorts of ways that people were referring to it. People were saying air it, which to me kind of makes sense, but I would say sky it. That's just what I learned when I grew up. That's what it was called. And people were saying waterfall. I've never heard that before. I understand why it's called that, because the water makes it falls. It's like a waterfall. I get it, but it's not what I would say. It was kind of interesting because there were also people in that thread saying, I don't know what this is called. I'm familiar with this, but I don't know what I would call it. Some people were saying air drink, which is a very literal but understandable. Like, I get it. Like, yeah, you're drinking it and it comes from the air. Like, I get it. I found it really fascinating how strongly people felt about the language that they used. People were like, oh, I don't know how you could call it anything else. This is skying it. And it's like, well, no, don't you... Like, you hear the term waterfall, air it, air drink, stuff like that. Like, okay, they might not roll off the tongue as well as the thing that you learned. And I completely agree with that. I prefer sky it 1,000,000% to any of the other terms that I saw in that thread. But I don't feel very strongly about which is the right way to say it. I'm very aware of the fact that the internet is a very, very international place. And, you know, expecting people to all refer to the same things the same way is ridiculous. And honestly, it's less fun that way. Because I found it like a learning experience to see, like, oh, all these people, like, from different places are, you know, referring to it in different ways. I find it more interesting that way. Like, I prefer the uniqueness of it. And I don't want to come off as preachy. I'm not saying that, like, this is the way to be. That, like, if you're not accepting of the way people refer to this action, then somehow you've done something wrong. Like, I don't want to extrapolate it into a bigger thing than it is. At the end of the day, we're talking about drinking water out of a water bottle. So it's not that deep, but it is interesting. And from a language perspective, as someone who's not super, like, you know, I'm not super into language. Some people are, like, super into, like, etymologies and language and stuff like that, grammar. I'm not super about that, but I do find it interesting. So, yeah, there's a thought for you.